Two police officers thought he was just another black man without a lawyer. They laughed. But when he placed his badge on the judge's bench, the laughter stopped. Because this wasn't just a defendant. This was the director of the FBI. And he was here for answers. Not for himself, but for every voice silenced in that courtroom before him. It was just another Monday morning in Jefferson County Courthouse, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The routine was familiar. A shuffle of cases. A few quick pleas. Some nervous defendants sitting quietly, most with court-appointed lawyers whispering last-minute advice. And then there was him. He walked in alone. No attorney by his side. No manila folders or legal pads. Just a simple gray suit, polished black shoes, and a look of calm that didn't quite match the tension in the room. His posture was straight. His hands stayed clasped in front of him. And his eyes scanned the room, not nervously, but deliberately, like someone measuring the temperature before stepping into water. At the prosecutor's table, two sheriff's deputies leaned back in their chairs. One of them nudged the other and tilted his head toward the man. A smirk formed. Then a whisper. Then a laugh, low but careless. Loud enough to be heard, but just quiet enough to claim it wasn't meant for him. They had seen this story before, or so they thought. Another defendant without a lawyer. Another poor black man who probably didn't understand the charges. Probably some low-level offense. Probably scared. Probably desperate. Probably. They didn't know who he was. And they didn't care to ask. The judge looked over the docket, raising an eyebrow at the missing counsel. "Sir, are you representing yourself today?" she asked. The man nodded once, calm, unbothered. He didn't shift in place, didn't stammer or mumble. Just a clear, quiet acknowledgement. He would speak when necessary, and only then. Behind him, a few others waiting for their cases looked on with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. There was something different about him, not just the suit or the silence, but the way he held himself, the way his presence commanded space without demanding it. But not everyone noticed that. The deputies surely didn't. To them, he was invisible in all the usual ways. No file on their desk. No arrest they remembered. No cuffs. Just a name they didn't recognize and a face that didn't trigger any memory or concern. Which made it funny, in that way that men in uniform sometimes laugh when they think they're safe. They leaned in again, one of them whispering, "Bet he tries the 'I didn't do it' speech." The other chuckled and rolled his eyes. "He's probably here on a shoplifting charge. Look at the shoes, trying too hard." It was more than laughter. It was dismissal. Dismissal wrapped in a uniform, seated behind a badge. The kind of laughter born from years of unchecked power and quiet assumptions. The kind that comes too easy in a place where certain people are always assumed guilty, even before they speak. The man didn't react. Not even a flicker. He just waited. The judge frowned and glanced again at the paperwork. Something didn't add up. There was no official charge next to his name, just a note that read, "Inquiry requested. By appointment." She paused, puzzled. This wasn't standard protocol. Before she could clarify, one of the deputies stood, assuming some kind of mistake had been made. "Your Honor, we don't have any record of this gentleman's arrest. We think he may be in the wrong courtroom." That's when the clerk chimed in. "He's here under special request," she said, her voice unsure but respectful. "Was told to place him on the morning docket, per federal instruction." That word, federal, hung in the air for a beat. It was subtle, but enough to make the officers glance at each other. Still, the smirks remained. One leaned on the table, scoffing just loud enough. "Sure, federal," he muttered, barely containing his sarcasm. "Next thing you know, he's CIA." The man didn't blink, didn't flinch, just waited, silent and still, as if every second was working in his favor. Because it was. People talk a lot about power, who has it, who doesn't, how it shows itself. But real power doesn't need to raise its voice. Real power walks into a room, sits down, and lets everyone else trip over their own assumptions. Real power doesn't correct people when they underestimate it. It just remembers. And on that Monday morning, in that small Mississippi courtroom, power was sitting in the front row, wearing a plain gray suit. and waiting for everyone else to catch up. Because this wasn't a defendant. This was a mirror. And by the time they figured that out, it would already be too late. The room hadn't quite settled when he moved. Calmly, deliberately, like someone following a script no one else could read. He reached into his coat, not fast, not slow, just with the confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The motion was subtle, almost unremarkable. But what came next was not. From the inside pocket, he pulled out a leather wallet, worn at the corners but meticulously kept. He walked forward without invitation, not stopping until he stood directly before the bench. No one said a word. Not the judge. Not the deputies. Not the handful of people sitting in the courtroom, suddenly aware that something unusual was unfolding. He placed the wallet on the judge's bench, opened it, and stepped back. For a second, there was silence. Then the air shifted. Inside the leather fold was an identification card, polished and pristine. Above the photo was a golden seal, and beneath it, bold black letters read, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Office of the Director. A badge rested beside it, heavy, gleaming, unmistakable. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't a joke. This was real. He didn't have to explain. The judge leaned forward slowly, her eyes scanning the name. And then they widened. Not just in surprise, but in recognition. The kind of recognition that hits when a name you've only seen in headlines suddenly becomes a person standing in front of you. She cleared her throat, but her voice had lost its rhythm. Words were suddenly harder to find. The deputies, still frozen near the prosecution table, had gone pale. The smirks had vanished. One of them tried to mask it with a cough. The other glanced nervously at the bailiff, who now stood straighter, as if he too had just realized the ground beneath them had shifted. No one knew he was coming. That was the point. He hadn't announced himself through official channels. He hadn't sent a team ahead. He hadn't brought news cameras or agents in dark suits. He wanted to see the place raw, untouched by protocol. Not through a report or a second-hand complaint, but with his own eyes. The system didn't change when it knew it was being watched. It changed when it realized it always was. What he had uncovered from afar had disturbed him. Dozens of complaints buried without follow-up. Courtroom footage routinely missing or deemed corrupted. Cases that smelled of racial bias, but lacked the hard proof needed for federal oversight. He had seen enough on paper. Now he needed to see the people behind those papers. And so he came, not as a director, not even as a cop, but as a man walking into a courtroom where his silence would speak louder than a press release ever could. The judge asked quietly, "Is this official business?" He nodded once. A file was handed to her. Thin, precise, and already tabbed. It contained summaries of internal affairs investigations, unresolved citizen complaints, and federal queries sent without response. There were names in that file, names that sat in that very room. The judge turned each page slowly. With every flip, the silence grew louder. The deputies could feel it. The weight of every time they had laughed at someone like him. The echo of their words, now hanging in the air with a different meaning. They weren't facing a defendant. They were facing someone who had been listening long before they started talking. He finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and clear. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply confirmed what he had observed, and what his office intended to do next. This wasn't an ambush. It was an audit. The judge, now visibly tense, nodded solemnly. "We will comply with all federal requests," she said. "And we will cooperate fully with the Bureau's investigation." He nodded again, then picked up his badge and ID. He placed them back inside his coat as neatly as he had revealed them. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already entered the room, and it wasn't leaving. The courtroom had changed in an instant, not because someone shouted, not because someone was dragged out in cuffs, but because the one man they dismissed was the only one with the authority to change everything. He didn't have to remind them who he was. The badge did that. The file did that. The silence did that. And as he turned and walked out of the courtroom, all that was left was the echo of footsteps and the weight of realization settling on every shoulder in the room. They hadn't just laughed at a stranger. They'd laughed at the one man who had come to hold them accountable. And now, the reckoning had begun. Long before he ever stepped into that courtroom, the investigation had already begun. Quietly, patiently, without fanfare. It started with a single complaint that had made its way to the Bureau, one that would have been easy to ignore. A handwritten letter from a former public defender, alleging misconduct in Jefferson County's court system. The kind of complaint that too often got lost in bureaucracy. But something about the tone, the details, the names, it didn't feel like fiction. Then came more. Not just from lawyers, but from former defendants. From courthouse staff. From a retired judge's assistant who claimed certain files were quietly removed from evidence logs. Each story alone might have seemed small, but when pieced together, they formed a pattern. Not of isolated mistakes, but of something far more dangerous. A system designed to hide its own rot. Complaints vanished after being submitted. Video footage that could have cleared defendants mysteriously went missing. Arrest records were altered to remove details that contradicted officer testimony. People who dared to speak up, particularly those from the black community, often found themselves suddenly facing unrelated charges or losing employment with no explanation. There was no smoking gun. Just a trail of smoke that never seemed to clear. The director didn't move quickly, not because he didn't care, but because he understood the cost of getting it wrong. If you challenge a system this entrenched, you only get one chance. So he ordered a slow, quiet build. Analysts went through years of body cam logs and court records. Tech teams traced the digital footprints of redacted documents. Confidential informants within the sheriff's department were interviewed in undisclosed locations. Everything was kept off the books. No subpoenas. No raids. Just listening, connecting, mapping. What they found went beyond bad policing. It pointed to deliberate patterns of abuse, coordinated neglect, and systemic targeting. Poor defendants, especially young black men, were routinely pressured into plea deals, even when evidence was weak or absent. Public defenders were overburdened to the point of exhaustion. Officers filed near-identical reports for unrelated arrests. Judges rarely questioned inconsistencies. It wasn't just a courtroom problem. It was a courthouse culture. And perhaps most chilling was the discovery of the gray file. An internal nickname used by officers for cases deemed non-essential for proper documentation, mostly involving suspects with little chance of fighting back. These cases rarely made it past arraignment. The evidence was always lost. The stories were always the same. And those who tried to resist often found themselves facing retaliation, legal or otherwise. All of this had remained hidden, until now. Once the badge was shown and the file placed on the judge's bench, the real work could begin in the open. Federal notice was served to the courthouse and sheriff's department within 48 hours. Every complaint ever filed against an officer in the county would be reviewed. Body cam footage would be subpoenaed. All cases involving missing evidence over the past 5 years were placed under federal audit. Some deputies didn't return to work the next day. Others tried to delete files, but the Bureau had already created backups. There were whispers in the halls, hushed meetings in parking lots. Officers who once laughed now consulted lawyers. And some, perhaps for the first time, started to speak up. A young officer came forward, anonymously at first, with audio recordings of meetings where superior officers joked about how easy it was to break a case if the defendant was broke and black. Another provided evidence of altered timestamps on surveillance footage. A clerk admitted she had been ordered to remove files from the court's public access system. Piece by piece, the truth began to take shape. The director never returned to that courtroom. He didn't need to. His presence had already shattered the illusion. The people who thought they owned that space now had to answer to it. And the community that had long whispered about injustice could finally speak without fear. For some, it came too late. There were names on the old dockets, men and women who had served time they shouldn't have, who had lost jobs, families, years. There would be restitution, but there would never be full repair. The damage had been done. What remained was the chance to stop it from continuing. The Bureau made clear that oversight would not end with a single sweep. Federal monitors would be stationed in the courthouse indefinitely. A full review board, diverse, external, and independent, was established to investigate claims going forward. Training programs were mandated. Every officer's record was under review. And no new cases would be tried without verified, unaltered digital evidence. What began as a quiet observation had grown into a full reckoning. No shouting. No camera crews. Just silence turned into action. Patience turned into pressure. And truth turned into accountability. The days following the investigation were unlike anything the town had experienced before. For a place that once operated in the shadows of routine injustice, suddenly everything was under the spotlight. Federal monitors walked the courthouse halls daily. Officers once emboldened by unchecked authority now moved cautiously, watched by eyes they could no longer ignore. There were no raids or arrests in the street. No media frenzy. Just a shift in power, quiet but unmistakable. The shock spread beyond the courtroom. Local news stations picked up the story, hesitant at first, but unable to ignore the magnitude of what had unfolded. The man they had assumed was another nameless defendant turned out to be the nation's top law enforcement official, standing silently in their courtroom with a badge that carried more weight than any title in their town. The clip of the judge reading his identification made its way across social media, prompting questions that local leadership could no longer avoid. Residents who had stayed silent for years, out of fear, resignation, or survival, began to speak. Some came forward with stories of being coerced into guilty pleas for crimes they didn't commit. Others described encounters with deputies who made thinly veiled threats or who disappeared evidence that could have proved their innocence. Past wrongs, long buried, began surfacing in conversations at church services, barbershops, gas stations, and PTA meetings. The air of fear that had blanketed the town for years began to thin. It didn't disappear overnight, but it cracked. And that crack was enough for light to begin breaking through. The police department faced a purge. Not in name, but in consequence. Officers who had been named in multiple complaints were placed on administrative leave. Some resigned quietly before formal investigations could begin. Others lawyered up, knowing the paper trail was too detailed, too damning to dismiss. The sheriff, once proud and loud, stopped appearing in public altogether. A federal review board would later recommend the department's restructuring under new oversight, with hiring practices and internal review mechanisms rebuilt from the ground up. The court system wasn't spared either. Several public defenders who had long struggled in silence gave sworn testimony about the pressure to accept plea deals, the lack of resources, and the subtle hostility they faced from judges when pushing back. Their testimonies were met with public sympathy and support, something they never expected. A few judges faced disciplinary review. Others retired early, choosing to step away rather than answer difficult questions under oath. But perhaps the most powerful shift happened outside of official institutions. Community groups that had long been disbanded due to fear or fatigue were reactivated. Parents who had once told their children to keep their heads down now encouraged them to raise their voices. Youth organizations began hosting Know Your Rights workshops. Churches opened their doors for legal aid clinics. The town, for the first time in a long while, began to believe it could protect itself, not just through prayer and perseverance, but through participation. In the weeks that followed, several old convictions were reopened. A few were overturned. In one case, a man who had served 5 years for a crime later proven impossible due to timestamps on forgotten security footage walked free, his record expunged, his name cleared. It was a small victory in a sea of loss, but it mattered. Not just for him, but for everyone who had watched from the sidelines wondering if justice would ever mean something more than a word painted on a building. The director never returned to the town, not physically. But his presence never really left. The policies his visit set into motion became permanent fixtures. Every courtroom had new surveillance. Every officer wore updated body cams. Evidence handling was now cross-verified by federal systems. Court transcripts, once hard to access, became public record within 24 hours. It was no longer possible to hide misconduct behind bureaucracy or silence. And that alone changed everything. In Washington, the case became a model. Not for punishment, but for reform. It was cited in congressional hearings about judicial transparency, police accountability, and racial bias in rural legal systems. The director, when asked why he chose to walk into that courtroom alone, simply replied, "Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be heard where the silence lives." The aftershock wasn't chaos. It was clarity. And it continued to ripple, not through panic, but through policy. Through conversations that were once impossible. Through eyes that now saw the system not as untouchable, but as transformable. What began with a laugh and a mistaken identity ended with a system forever altered. Not by force, not by fear, but by truth walking calmly through the door and refusing to leave. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that doesn't raise itself. This wasn't just a courtroom twist. It was a mirror, held up to a system that too often survives on silence and assumption. One man, one badge, and the quiet courage to confront everything hidden in plain sight. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think twice, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Because real change doesn't happen when the cameras turn off. It happens when people finally see what they were never meant to. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories that reveal the power of truth, justice, and humanity. Until next time, stay aware, stay strong, and never underestimate the quiet ones.